In 2025, Netflix released the docudrama Toxic Town, starring Jodie Whittaker, Amy Lou Wood and Robert Carlyle, amongst an all-round stellar cast. This 4-episode series focuses on a group of mothers and the landmark case that was able to associate toxic waste spread not just with water but with atmospheric conditions and the resultant birth defects that occurred in their children in the late 1980s and early 1990s. This lecture will not focus on the factual accuracy of that show, but instead some of the scientific background behind it. But before some scientific background, a little bit of historical background. In the early 1990s, Corby town in Northamptonshire, UK had a population less than 2,000 people. But all of that changed in the 1930s when the steel firm Stewarts and Lloyds decided they were going to build an integrated iron and steel works in this town. By 1951, the population had grown tenfold, being around 20,000 people, and it was estimated that in the 1940s this population was around 15,000 people, but the value is estimated because of course there was a war on. However, in 1967 the steel industry in the United Kingdom was nationalised and it was decided that it would be focused on 5 key areas within the country, and Corby town was not one of these key areas. In 1979 the Corby Iron and Steel Works was indeed closed down, leading to massive job loss and 30% unemployment in that local area. To combat this and revitalise the town, the local council implemented the Corby Redevelopment Initiative, and it was during this period that the toxic waste was allegedly spread throughout the local community. I must say that I have to say allegedly, because Corby Council never fully took responsibility for the toxic waste mismanagement, and so they were never fully associated with the birth defects. The Corby Iron and Steel Works, from the information that I could gather, utilised the basic oxygen steel making process, or the Linzer-Dunszen-Verfahren process, to generate their output. This converts molten pig iron, produced from the smelting of iron ore, into steel by a series of oxidation reactions. Approximately 70% of all steelworks in this time period utilised this process, which I think provides further validity that, again, the Corby Iron and Steel Works also did this. Steel making is a batch process, and with this methodology, cooled oxygen and lime is blown into the molten pig iron, and the resulting oxidation reactions remove the impurities. After a few rounds of this, carbon and other elements are then added to this molten metal to introduce specific properties to the steel, and then this is then poured into moulds and cooled before undergoing more specialised processes for more specific steel uses. If the topic of this video didn't give it away, the production of steel produces a lot of waste, and this comes in one of 2 flavours, slag and dust, and the majority of that is these slags, synthetic rock-like materials formed by the fusion of non-iron compounds found within the raw iron ore. Thus, it is of note that more slag is produced during the iron smelting stages rather than the steel processing stages of steel production, but this Corby Steel Works is a combined iron and steel works, remember. So the processing of iron and steel was done at this site, and therefore the types of waste that we're about to discuss would have been produced there. Blast furnace slag, the blast furnace being where the iron ore is melted down into pig iron, mainly consists of silicates and aluminosilicates, which do have some beneficial uses in the production of things like roadstone and concrete. But that being said, it also contains 1.5 to 2% sulphur, and the leaching of water-soluble sulphur compounds into the environment once this slag is buried is one of the most common causes of water pollution associated with the steel making process. Furthermore, some of these water-soluble sulfates, when in a high enough concentration, can further react to become sulfoaluminates, which can increase in their volume by up to 120%. And so when buried, this can result in considerable ground heave at those burial sites. Interestingly, some of the slags have been found to be quite beneficial to plants and make for useful fertilizer components. But that being said, many of the waste metals, such as nickel, copper, lead and zinc, have the potential to be highly toxic at the right, or should I say wrong, concentrations. Somewhat fortunately, the high alkaline pH of the slag means that it often reacts with calcium compounds within the soil, making those toxic metals insoluble and thus much less likely to leach into the surrounding water supplies. And if you've seen Toxic Town, you may remember that there's a scene where they are testing the water and they come up with, they don't find any toxic waste in their water supplies, and this could indeed be the reason why. Dusts, however, are the main source of inorganic contamination into the local environment when it comes to the manufacturing of steel. Not only can these dusts be airborne, but are also highly leachable. And as you might imagine, these dusts are coarse-grained materials, similar in size to sand, and are removed from the gases by dust catchers. Basically like a big net. The burying and excavation of these materials can release these fine particulates into the air, and this contains again the copper, the zinc, the lead, the nickel, but also things like cadmium, chromium, alkali metals, halides, which are binary compounds containing one part halogen, so like chlorine, and one part something else, and then even things like arsenic. Copper, zinc, lead, nickel, cadmium, chromium, arsenic, these are all considered heavy metals, a very umbrella term for metallic elements that have a high density and molecular weight when compared to water. Now some of these, such as copper and zinc, are essential for human life at low concentrations, whereas others have no biological function at all. Yet what they do all share is that at certain concentrations and above, they are all highly toxic. Heavy metal poisoning affects the fetus, leading to reproductive disorders in the mother, low birth weights and lengths, reduced head and chest circumference, poor cognitive development, as well as damaging the developing organs and organ systems. Of course, we see this in Toxic Town, as not only do the children born have physical deformities, but it is mentioned in some of the scenes that the children aren't doing so well at school and some have weakened immune systems. But of course, Shelby Ann dies a few days after her birth, and this is a result of her kidneys and her heart not being fully formed. There is also a higher probability that heavy metal poisoning will result in the termination of a pregnancy preterm in the form of miscarriage, and similar proportions of mothers have been reported in different communities around the world that all have been exposed to heavy metals. But why is this the case? Well, the developing embryo is a mass of highly ordered, rapidly dividing cells. And so damaging any of these cells, whether that be through toxic substances or something else, is going to interrupt this very ordered sequence. It's somewhat analogous to chemotherapy in that the rate of cell division in the tumour is much higher than the average cell, and therefore the toxic chemicals that are used in chemotherapy place those rapidly dividing cells at risk compared to the cells of the rest of your body. To provide further insight into the effects that heavy metals are having, I took a look at a paper published in 2003 that analysed over 37,000 placental gene transcripts to look for multi-dimensional relationships with 11 heavy metals and metalloids. Those are elements with metallic properties. The first gene of interest was DNMT1, DNA methyltransferase 1, which was observed to be upregulated in association with increased exposure to lead, niobium and antimony. DNA methyltransferase enzymes add and maintain methyl groups added to the DNA strand, and this is a form of epigenetic modification, modifications to the DNA outside of the DNA itself. The addition of these methyl groups will then alter the expression levels of the genes on that associated strand of DNA. And one such region of DNA that these genes were coding for was for the proteins IGF-BP1 and IGF-2-BP1, binding proteins for the hormone insulin-like growth factor 1 and 2. This hormone is essential for growth, as you might have gathered from the name, and the paper noted that higher percentile levels of these binding proteins were associated with lower levels of IGF, and in turn this led to a reduced fetal weight, fetal growth, and as a result a reduced average birth weight, as you might expect. Additionally, this was associated with the state of inflammation within the neonate, and this may be tied to changes in NF-kappa B expression. NF-kappa B is basically the master transcription factor in regards to immune responses within the cell. Thus, dysregulation within this system is going to lead to a poorer immune response and has been associated with certain types of brain damage and a reduced mental capacity, both of which were of note in the children in Toxic Town. Another result of the paper focused on the gene EIF2, coding for the protein eukaryotic initiation factor 2, an essential protein that is necessary for the translation of genes, turning them from strands of DNA that then have become RNA into functional proteins. The authors made note that multi-metal exposure led to a downregulation of EIF2, decreasing the signaling of genes associated with the growth of the fetus, and reduced rates of cell division within the placenta, making it less of a protective barrier. And of course, less protection means the developing fetus is now at further risk from continued heavy metal exposure and the toxic effects they cause. Lastly, I want to mention our old friends who sadly haven't shown up in the last few videos, reactive oxygen species. Heavy metal exposure activates the antioxidant response, as they themselves can contribute to the production of those dangerous reactive oxygen species radicals. Therefore, continuous exposure leads to the depletion of this defense mechanism, meaning more reactive oxygen species and more of the associated DNA damage will occur over time. This, of course, will cause cell death, and cells dying as a result of this in the developing fetus will disrupt this highly regulated process and may be one of the major contributory factors leading to the malformed limbs in those suffering from heavy metal exposure. Now, I know it's been a hot minute since Toxic Town came out and people have most definitely moved on to the next big thing in streaming, but I would highly recommend going back to watch this 4-episode series to gather some insight into some of the effects of toxic waste and importantly how a group of mothers came together despite many challenges and setbacks to put something right. Thank you for watching.